All right there, econ friends, welcome back for video 2 in our discussion of fiscal policy. In our first video, we laid out what fiscal policy is and the two tools of it, government spending and taxation. We laid out what expansionary and contractionary policies entail, and we discussed the multiplier. In this video, what we're going to be looking at is the effectiveness and some of the factors that can influence the effectiveness of fiscal policy. And we start off with what's really a basic idea, something that should be common sense, but in economics, we're extremely concerned with understanding any of the factors that can either inhibit or increase the effectiveness of expansionary fiscal policies. Now, to be clear, we said last time that there can be expansionary and contractionary policies, but we know in the real world, because of the incentives that we spoke about before, there's not going to be much contractionary. So we're going to leave that off the table for now, and we're going to focus on expansionary fiscal policies. And we're going to be really concerned in economics with the factors that can either increase or inhibit its effectiveness. And there's a couple of factors that I want you to be aware of. Number one, timing factors. And number two, the possibility of what we call in economics crowding out, also known as the crowding out effect. So again, in this video, we're going to take our knowledge of fiscal policy and we're going to dig a little bit into a couple of factors that may inhibit or possibly enhance the effectiveness. By way of context, let's remember what fiscal policy is really all about. Okay, you'll recall that one goal, probably the main goal of an effective stabilization policy, that basically the goal of our monetary and or fiscal policies is ultimately to smooth out the business cycle. We know the business cycle are these ups and downs, and they imply fluctuations and short-term variability and, either expansionary periods or recessionary periods that both have some economic ills associated with them. So ideally, we want to use these policies to kind of smooth out that business cycle, to minimize that volatility in the market, in the economy, okay? Ideally, so here comes some jargon, but think about it. Put it in context. Ideally, policies should be expansionary during the early stages of a recession. Okay? Policies should be expansionary when we sense that a recession is beginning. And of course, we would do this because those expansionary policies can reduce unemployment. So ideally, in a perfect world, policymakers would put forward expansionary policies at the very beginning, at the very early stages of a recession, and this will reduce unemployment. And on the flip side, policies should be contractionary during an economic boom in order to counter higher inflation. So if the economy is expanding too much, kind of booming too much, we want to contract it. If the economy is in the recession, we want to expand it. The fancy word for this is that effective policy, ready, should be what we call counter-cyclical. Effective stabilization policies should be counter-cyclical, which means that they go against the cycle. They're the opposite of the cycle. So they're contractionary during booms and they're expansionary during recessions. And in a perfect world, that's how it would go. But there can be some problems. One major problem is this. If lawmakers, if legislatures do not get the timing correct, their policies may actually end up being what we call pro-cyclical. Pro-cyclical means that the policies would align with the business cycle phase. So again, we want these counter-cyclical policies. We want to contract during booms and expand during recessions. But if you think about it, to do that successfully would require that politicians get the timing right, that they implement the right policy at the right time. Easier said than done. In fact, if they do not get the timing correct, their policies can end up being what we call pro-cyclical. A pro-cyclical policy would be expansionary during the booms and contractionary during the recessions. This would not be good, because what a pro-cyclical policy would do, it would actually make the business cycle even more volatile, which is not desirable. And it would result in these stabilization policies that actually destabilize the economy. Imagine that you are feeling a little ill. You go to the doctor with this illness. He prescribes a medication. You want to make sure that you take the medication when you're ill to fight the illness. If you get the timing wrong, and by the time the doctor prescribes the medication or by the time you take it, you're already healthy, then the medication not only won't help you fix your ailment, which is gone, it may actually cause another problem, which is not good. That's the basis of what we call a pro-cyclical policy. We want to avoid those. You can see right here in panel A, this would be a counter-cyclical policy when things are well-timed. And you have here in the blue, a business cycle. And the idea of a counter-cyclical policy is it's going to slow things down in an expansion and pick things up in a recession and kind of flatten out, smooth out that business cycle. On the other hand, panel B shows what might happen if we get the timing wrong and we go pro-cyclical. We still have our original business cycle here in blue, but if we make a mistake, right, if we prescribe the wrong medicine at the wrong time, we may actually end up increasing booms and inflation and increasing the depth of recessions and therefore causing even more unemployment. We know from our economic thinking module that this would be called unintended consequences in economic thinking, because instead of stabilizing and smoothing the business cycle, these poorly timed policies might destabilize it and make it more volatile. But the reality is, my friends, that's a risk that we take with fiscal policies, in large part because in democracies, fiscal policies are budget policies. They're lawmaking policies, and therefore they have to go through a political process which can take time. And these timing effects can lead to delays. We call this broad idea that the political process, because it takes a long time to get things passed, can have some delays. We know this by the term policy lag. Policy lag can be broken up actually into three types, each one leading to the other. The recognition lag would be the time span between when like a recession starts and when policy makers actually recognize it. In other words, the time between when a recession officially starts and people can say, we see the data, we're in a recession. This might take, in some cases, 3 to 6 months. Once you have that, you would have what's called the implementation lag. The implementation lag is the time between when you recognize the problem and when the policy actually gets implemented to address it. You can imagine that if government budgets are on an annual cycle, it might take 6 to 9, maybe even up to 12 months, the length of a fiscal year, for politicians to argue out, flesh out, debate out, negotiate out, and then pass the legislation for the fiscal policy. That's an additional lag. And finally, even if we get the recognition and implementation lags under control, we have what is known as the impact lag. And the impact lag is the time between when you implement the policy and when the policy actually has its subsequent impact on the economy. It's the time between when you take the aspirin and the headache goes away, or when you take the aspirin or the medication the doctor gave you and the problem is fixed. When you add together these recognition, implementation, and impact lags, you can have a pretty long policy lag. And in a poorly timed scenario, that will become pro-cyclical and actually make the economy more volatile. Now, note that the automatic stabilizers that we discussed in our first video, these are designed in part to alleviate some of those lag problems. Since they don't need legislation to get passed, they're going to automatically adjust. And therefore, these can kind of mitigate and alleviate some of the lags. So our first potential problem is a timing problem, the lag problem. Our second potential problem when it comes to the effectiveness of fiscal policy can be dampened by what we know as the crowding out effect. Now, the crowding out effect tends to be fairly hotly debated in economics. I'll take no position on it, but I want you to be aware of it. The crowding out effect, by definition, is the reduction in private spending, that is C&I, that results from an increase in government spending. In other words, the crowding out effect would say that if G goes up, that might cause C and I to go down. And if you think about our formula, Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M, the crowding out effect, if it holds, might imply that if G goes up, C and I might fall. And that would sort of take away the impact of G going up, which would make the fiscal policy not that effective. So that's the basis behind crowding out, the crowding out effect in that theory. Now, the crowding out effect, again, it implies that increased government spending will increase the demand for loanable funds. So now we're going into the mechanics of how people who advocate crowding out, how they analyze it. So we know what it is. Here's the analysis behind it. People who believe crowding out, they say this: if the government increases government spending, they're going to have to borrow money. We learned in our monetary policy lectures about the loanable funds market and interest rates. So what they're going to say is, if the government wants to spend more money, then they're going to have to increase the demand for loanable funds. Well, you know from the loanable funds market that any increase in the demand for money is going to push interest rates up. And the theory holds that once interest rates go up, we're going to see, excuse me, we're going to see decreasing private spending on consumption. So again, the chain of events would say government spending goes up, so the government has to borrow more money, the demand for loanable funds goes up, therefore the interest rate goes up. The interest rate going up is a counter incentive, and that will therefore decrease or lead to reducing C&I. This data shows one specific incidence of crowding out. You see this was right around 1944, middle of World War II. American economy, really war-driven. We see that the government has increased, that's the red line, has increased dramatically its spending as a share of GDP, which usually happens in wartime. Okay, a lot of government spending here, so we're seeing G go up. And you can see the corresponding drop. When you look at the blue line, you see the trend line, big drop right here in C and I. So we see C plus I falling. Okay, people who believe in crowding out say that that increased government spending is what led to higher interest rates, which is then going to counter incentivize or de-incentivize consumption and investment spending. And you see the impact right there in the 40s during World War II. Now, other people disagree with this, and there's a lot of academic debate in economics about, does the crowding effect hold? And if it holds, how strong is it? I won't weigh in on that. I just want you to be aware of what the theory suggests. So we have two cases in which expansionary policies may not work perfectly, if at all, if there's timing lags or if there's crowding out. The third time when expansionary policies will not be effective is any time that the economy is operating at full employment. The theory holds that if the economy is operating at full employment, if it's operating at its potential maximum output, then any type of expansionary policy will not increase output, but will instead accelerate inflation. So now, my friends, you understand fiscal policy, you know the mechanics of it, you know the expansionary, contractionary, and the multiplier. With this lecture, we've talked about a few factors that may affect the effectiveness or the efficacy of fiscal policies. Timing factors, crowding out factors, and the idea raised in our last bullet that expansionary policies may not be effective, actually will not be effective when the economy is at full employment. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time.